This feels like The View.
I know.
May it be as lively. So I'm going to just start by, again, thanking everyone. Danielle did a beautiful job, but I have just been so impressed at how well organized this has been for months ago, and it's exciting to see everybody in the room. I'm also going to now introduce my panelists, our conversationalists, our thinkers in public, quickly, because you have their full bios. To my left, immediate left, is Aaron Hedlund, who is now the chief economist of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Next is Kadeem Nooreh, who is an assistant professor at the Harvard Business School, right down the street. Next is Heather Boucher, who was a former member of the Council of Economic Advisors and now is a professor of practice at the Kennedy School. And last but not least, Jason Furman, who was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and also a professor now of practice at the University of Pennsylvania. So,
got us backwards.
Real
But that's
swap.
okay.
I did. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I did.
All good.
You all can probably read better than I can. So we're going to talk about neoliberalism is dead. What are some of the big ideas? We just heard some from Danielle. We heard some from Jen. This is, the first thing I'm going to say is I was a law professor at the law school for 8 years. We are not going to fight the hypothetical. We are not going to debate whether neoliberalism is dead or what it was when it was alive. We are going to accept the hypothetical, and we're going to talk about what is next. I think also, though, we are not going to assume there is a paradigm fully formed or even necessarily emerging, and we heard that also. There are big ideas out there, and they have different proponents, but they are definitely emergent, and I hope we're going to have quite a lot of debate about them. Some of them we've heard, I'll just list them again: human flourishing, abundance or chosen scarcity, as Thompson and Klein define it, well-being. I will just say there's a new book out called The London Consensus from LSE. We're going to hear from Larry Kramer next. It is a 40 years on new take on the Washington Consensus from the late 80s. And the first principle of the London Consensus is that money matters, not surprising, and so does well-being. I think that's striking from that particular group of economists. Community and place, national strength and cohesion. And so I'm going to ask each of our conversationalists to talk first about what ideas they see in 3 minutes. I'm going to model this, and I really am going to hold people so we can have a conversation. So the idea that I see, in part because I'm one of its generators, that will happen a lot today, but I think one of the things that is emerging is the idea of an economy for whole people. And by whole people, I mean human beings who need connection and belonging as much as they need separation and achievement. That we need to be part of a family or a community, a group of friends, as much as we need to be individuals who set our own agenda and are enabled to achieve it. If you think about people that way, lots of different policies follow, one of which, for instance, everyone will be a caregiver at some point in their lives, as opposed to what we now think. So that would be my contribution. The title today is From Left to Right, but we are going to go from right to left. We're going to do that. I'm going to call on Aaron first, but I'm also going to then say we should not be presuming that we know where people fall on a political spectrum that frankly makes no sense to me. It certainly is not the traditional kind of small government, big government, conservatism versus liberals. I would invite us to simply assume that these are ideas, they may overlap in all sorts of ways. But that said, at least relatively, I am going to start with Aaron, and we will go down the row.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to do kind of a study, a kind of a contrast between what I'll call kind of some neoliberalism themes versus some alternative themes that are kind of undergirding a lot of what the current administration is thinking. And I'd say some of the new thinking on the right, the new right. So let me start with theme number one. On the neoliberal side, globalism, open borders, individuals as kind of automatons on the one side. And then the alternative view is more of an emphasis on sovereignty. There actually are cultures and societies, not just groups of individuals with arbitrary lines drawn around them to call it a country. So that's kind of theme number one. Theme number two on the neoliberal side is technocracy, a trust in elites, a belief in institutionalism, and a strong commitment to rules-based policy. The alternative to that is democratic accountability, a skepticism of some of the elites as rent-seeking gatekeepers, and a belief in constrained discretion. The next theme I would put as, broadly speaking, kind of absolutism versus pragmatism. So when you talk about trade, you could think about free trade absolutism, and kind of a separation of economics from politics versus, on the alternative, a belief in reciprocity and the reality that politics cannot be separated from economics. And then similarly on the kind of fundamentalism versus pragmatism side, you have market fundamentalism versus market pragmatism.
You may be, hold on one second. I think you're getting a handheld.
Does this work now? Okay.
Great.
Now I'm real fancy here. So continuing on this theme of absolutism versus pragmatism, you have market fundamentalism versus market pragmatism, which pragmatism just means acknowledgement that there are frictions, there are uncompensated losers. Then lastly, utilitarian consumerism on the neoliberal side, and a focus on unbridled efficiency versus productive dignity and purpose. And labor is not some sort of divorced thing from capital. Human capital is actually a very essential form of capital. So I'll pause there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kadeem.
Is my mic working? We're good? Okay.
Yep.
You took a lot of the concepts there.
Privilege of going first.
Also, this is the nicest treehouse I've ever been in. Okay, so I think I'm just going to open with a couple of questions that I've been thinking a lot about. I think the first one is, what does it look like to have a system where the knowledge elite are actually legitimate and held accountable? That's something I've been thinking a lot about. I think certainly on the right, it's pretty clear, and with a lot of the populace, it's pretty clear. There's a lack of trust in the knowledge elite, how they end up in the positions that they end up in, and whether or not the public actually has any say on the influence that they have on policies and in different kinds of institutions. And for whatever reason, it makes me think about ancient Greece. It makes me think about Socrates. And if you go back to a lot of Plato's dialogues, there's this constant debate between the people who make things salient, so make, the sophists that are making these arguments that everyone pays attention to, they're supposed to give you power. And then on the other hand, there are the people who are making knowledge. And these, prior to Socrates, a lot of these are natural philosophers that are interested in using techniques to understand the world. Socrates is sort of this character, this like translational figure who tries to take these analytical methods and bring them into questions that people find interesting and get them to pay attention to. Right now, it feels to me like society is in a place where we have a lot of these knowledge producers that are interestingly getting at truth in a lot of different ways. And then there are institutions that produce what people pay attention to. These things are not related, and there's a dearth of people who actually act as these translational figures. And I think translational figures, people who actually persuade and articulate what is actually true to people and feel that it's an obligation. You actually have to do that. I think those people are missing. And I think a big part of what's going on in our current situation has to do with that. So I'm going to stop there, but yeah.
Can I follow up for one? So would you agree with Aaron that one of the things that is emerging is deep skepticism of elites?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, okay.
And I think I'm particularly interested in knowledge elites, experts, just because I don't think that there's a way that we adjust what's going on in the country in a way that's positive through policy if it's the case that we can't actually make use of the knowledge that we have. And I think the skepticism is making it difficult to actually get this knowledge to be used by political actors.
Okay, Aaron, we'll come back to you. So Heather.
Okay. Well, a lot of the great points have already been made, so this is making it already, I think, a super interesting conversation. I wanted to highlight a couple of things, and then I want to riff off a couple of things that have already been said, both earlier and on this session. So, one thing is I think about this question about after neoliberalism, it comes down to the starting point for me usually is what questions are we asking? And for a long time, the debate, at least in Washington, D.C., where I've spent my career, is, it's big government, small, but it's really markets versus states. Yeah. That's been the big left-right dividing line. And yet, when I think about what's emerging and, the things that have already been said here on this beautiful blue sofa, it seems like the new question that is emerging is that in a democracy, for a long time, we haven't been asking this question about what kinds of economic outcomes are serving our political boundaries, which are also geographic boundaries, versus process questions around markets, which are often transnational and are no way connected to place. And so place has come up in a number of elements already. And what I find interesting is that it's often sort of this separate thing over here, place-based or places, rather than, well, actually our democracy is bounded by geographic boundaries that define what somebody who works for a government, an elected official, is responsible for. So this question of what we make in our political boundaries, in our what most Americans think of as their economy, how that production happens, are bounded in a way that I think what neoliberalism did is it separated them. That's what globalization is. It's somehow we can have markets in the economy that are no longer connected to places and to political boundaries. And that feels like a big piece of the question that we're all trying to ask. Today is, what does it mean to live and work in a place? I was really inspired this morning, at least in the green room. I don't know if it was up here, but there were all of these photos up on the walls, and these were all, it looked like they were real places, real people. The story that Danielle told about a human in a place trying to get to school and work and home, and that is their economy. So a lot of these questions about values are about people in places. So the what we make and how we make it was a big theme that we talked a lot about every day in my time in the Biden administration, but it's what we are making in a place and how that production happens. So that it feels like there's something there to pursue. And part of that is that it's not about process, it's about outcomes. Mm-hmm. And that feels really important. What are the outcomes that we're trying to deliver versus we're just trying to have a process that we think is fair or reasonable or efficient. And yet what people want, what voters want, what communities want is actual deliverables. And something that I at least my understanding of the economic history is that decades ago, to your point about elites, many of the people that we're serving in the capacity that we're serving or that I served or that Jason served actually came up through the party. They weren't just sort of not random, but they weren't necessarily just elites sort of plucked out of universities, but they were connected to that political orientation and the outcomes that they were, that the party was trying to deliver. So there might be something in there that we could talk about this morning. I will stop there and let the person to my left this morning.
Jason.
So, first of all, just in talking about the whole paradigm, there's a part of me that thinks linking Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama makes just as much sense as saying that everything is the same now under Trump as it would have been under Harris. And when I say makes about as much sense, I think in some sense that's because I think it makes relatively little sense. The world, I think, would be quite different under those two presidents. But there actually are some commonalities. Skepticism about trade, skepticism about economic modeling, a greater willingness to be involved in reshaping industry and the economy is a common line between Biden, what Harris would have done, and what Trump has done. But I think that's actually much less important than the differences between Reagan and Clinton and Obama on one side and between Biden and Harris on one side and Trump is on the other side. And I think that's related to what has been to some degree missing from a lot of the conversation, which is quantification, scale, and carefully looking at the consequences of things. I'll give an example of, and I think when you do that, you'll find that an awful lot of what matters is in the fiscal system, and that's where the debate between the two parties are at their most different. The biggest debate going on in Washington right now isn't at a sort of high plane of post-neoliberalism. It is, should a set of subsidies for people to get health insurance be continued after January or not continued after January? And I think every Democrat is in favor of continuing them. And most Republicans, although a significant number are dissenting, are on the other side of that. That in many ways is sort of a classic neoliberal thing. We're going to have a market for health insurance, a marketplace, and then we're going to take the people that can least afford it and give them subsidies to help them buy it. Turns out that operates at scale. Turns out I think that's actually a relatively popular thing. There's this idea that somehow fiscal transfers can be undignified, that it's better to do pre-distribution, get people more money, more dignity through their jobs. I sort of agree with that, with the caveat that I'm not sure we know how to do it, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I don't see anyone who's getting these subsidies saying, oh, this is a handout from the government, don't give it to me, it's undignified, I'd rather sort of earn my health insurance myself. And that gets back to the scale thing. In 2015, there were many economic issues we were facing in the Obama administration, but two of them happened to come up at the same time. One was about expanding overtime pay for workers. It fit very well into the post-neoliberal frame. Labor unions were very excited. Nick Hanauer and the American Prospect were very excited. Elizabeth Warren was very excited. We were getting an enormous amount of incoming pushing us to do it in the White House. At the same time, tax credits were expiring for the Earned Income Tax Credit and Refundable Child Tax Credit. Those we got incoming from one person, and his name was Bob Greenstein, I guess, and Ellen Nissenbaum was the other. A sort of pretty classic neoliberal redistributive type of policy. The political incoming was like 100 to 1 for the overtime. When you did the analysis of the Department of Labor, which did an analysis that I think was entirely static and put every single thumb on the scale you could for the overtime policy, no adjustments in pay, hours, et cetera, they got that it was a $3 billion increase a year, with most of that money going to college graduates in their 20s. The other policy, the sort of neoliberal one, was $25 billion a year with, I think, 16 million children in poverty getting that money. And it sort of made me wonder. One of them felt quite righteous. You're taking an unfair thing corporations are doing where they're shortchanging people from their overtime pay. You're remaking capitalism. You're giving people dignity. But at the end of the day, you are at most giving $3 billion to a bunch of college graduates. The other one, $25 billion, children in poverty. And I think keeping that scale in mind maybe isn't relevant for a political campaign, but is relevant for reality. And I'll just give one last example of it as a provocation. The whole antitrust agenda is in part motivated by reducing wealth inequality and the way wealth translates into power. Well, if you want to reduce wealth inequality, you need to lower the stock prices of the people that own these companies. Is the idea that the agenda is supposed to lower the stock price of Amazon by 30%? That would lower Jeff Bezos' wealth by 30%. It would still leave him with, I didn't check the latest numbers, hundreds of billions of dollars, probably still the ability to afford the Washington Post. And by the way, you can't even get to Elon Musk through antitrust. There isn't an antitrust issue there. And so to me, I'd like to do as much pre-distribution as possible. I think it tends to not be quantified, and when you do, it tends to be a lot smaller and a bit more disappointing than you'd think. Redistribution, taxing Jeff Bezos, and giving that money to people for health care is something that Biden and Obama and Clinton all had in common, something that there's been greater skepticism from everyone from Reagan through Trump. And to me, that sort of old-fashioned fiscal redistributive divide is the quantitatively much more important one, and we should figure out a way to get ourselves more excited about it.
Thank you, and thank you for really sticking to time. We've got plenty of time for conversation. In the last 15 minutes, we will open it up to all of you, so keep your questions and put them in the Slido, preferably then, because if you put them in now, it's very hard for me to both moderate and engage and note down the questions. So I hear three potential areas of agreement. I hear some disagreement, and definitely, Jason, I take your point, but starting with Aaron's very fulsome set of concepts, I hear some real agreement on not just the fact of distrust of technocracy, but the idea that the technocracy or the elites are not accountable and should be. So that's where I hear agreement, that there should be greater accountability than there is now. And maybe that also means a different way of, you can push back, hold on. Just hold on. So that is something I thought I heard. The second is around place. And I think this really is very important because look, this is, it's the heart of the liberal, as in the political liberalism dilemma. It's a universal doctrine based on all humans being equal and all humans having basic rights, and yet we have to have borders. So, political theorists have been trying to navigate that forever. Part of what you heard here is, regardless of how you resolve it theoretically, practically, if you want to stay in power and do any of the good things that you want to be able to do, you must recognize exactly, I thought you put it very well, that there are political borders, there are geographic borders, because we don't have any other way of doing it. And even where we do, like the EU, there's still an overall boundary. So I heard agreement on that. And then I think I heard agreement, and probably I'm presuming some of it. But Aaron, where you ended on the importance of productive labor and dignity, that may be or may not be an agreement on unions, but it is an agreement that what we are doing, what we have been doing in neoliberalism is not serving workers, which I think is really quite key. So I'm going to put those on the table as areas of agreement for concepts that matter. And we're not just going to go down the row. I'm going to ask Heather first, and you all talk to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think those make sense. I would agree that those seem like three places where I also heard agreement. On the accountability, I had like two questions for what does that mean? I mean, one is literally what does it mean to hold elites accountable? What are we asking for? And is it that, is it where they're coming from? There's all of this new research on the economics profession, for example, that shows that economists, tend to be a profession much more than others, where people that make it through these programs come from elite backgrounds, and it tends to be much more closed than other disciplines and even other math-oriented disciplines. What does that mean? Is that what we mean by holding elites accountable? Are we asking for more diversity in who gets into these professions? Is it what kinds of experiences that they're having? Are we saying people should work on the shop floor for a while before they get to do economic policy? I guess I just want to push us, what does it mean to hold elites accountable? But one of the ways that we hold elites accountable is through our democracy. And I think that this, and I want to riff on something that Jason said about the difference between something like overtime and a tax benefit. And one of the things that you noted, Jason, was that if it's not relevant for that maybe the way that you were framing it wasn't relevant for a political campaign. But I think the question is, if it's not relevant for what people are demanding or wanting or seeing in their lives, then should that, how do we think about the priorities? It's like, well, okay, it may be that on paper, this is a better policy, but if people don't feel that and aren't asking for it, how do we think about that? Because that to me seems to get to this elite question that we're telling people what they want, but yet I do not mean to imply that I don't believe in the analysis. I guess I'm just questioning, especially because I know there's a lot of political theorists and people in the room that are not economists. How do we reconcile the fact that something like the child tax credit, which we expanded in the first year of the Biden administration, huge and important, was allowed to expire? I don't recall any protests or anybody seeming to care, and yet this was a policy that cut child poverty in half. How do we reconcile that with the fact that we've seen 50 years now of rising inequality and wages falling, and that seems to me gets at the crux of this overtime issue. So there's something in there that elites just we're not capturing or gathering, and would different elites from different backgrounds help that? I'm not sure.
Absolutely.
I mean, three things to pick up on from that, Heather. I mean, one is I think the economics profession is skewed in lots of ways. The way you described is one. Another is that virtually no economists, very few economists under the age of 45 have ever voted for a Republican for national office. So if you did a survey at the NBER, you're going to see generally support for example, higher taxes and higher child tax credits. There's all sorts of skewness. The second thing I'd say is with fiscal policies, they sort of go through, tax and transfer policies, a three-part cycle. They're popular when you propose them. They're unpopular and disappointing shortly after they happen. And then they become really popular again when you try to take them away. And some political scientists should actually study this, but that's what exactly matches the Affordable Care Act, for example. The child tax credit didn't last long enough for that to kick in. What we're seeing now with the premium tax credits for healthcare may be long enough because it's taking it away, even though it's a natural expiration. The last thing is I think we do need to be a little bit more careful on documenting different trends in inequality. It's a little bit more complex. I mean, if you divide the world into quarter centuries, the best, most inclusive growth was 1950 to 1975. The second best was 2000 to 2025, and the worst was 1975 to 2000. In fact, wage inequality measured top to bottom peaked in 2013 and has been falling pretty steadily since. So there's a lot of different cross currents there that are, I think, important to keep in mind.
So I'm going to turn to Aaron to come back to this question. So what does it mean to have accountability for elites? And what you're raising also, Heather, is the paternalism. I mean, that's a paternalistic decision. I remember debating this with Cass Sunstein for hours about, if you think this is better for people and you think they think it is, but they don't know it, so I'm going to come back to that. I'll just say, having been a dean with a faculty of many economists, one of the skews is that economists tend to believe that people really are rational calculators because so many economists are. I will just add that from my perception. Seriously, we have different views of human nature underlying a lot of these questions. So in that sense, I would put it on the table. Aaron.
Yeah, so first of all, I can't wade too much into the premium tax credit thing because it's an ongoing issue, but I actually don't think that's the best policy to highlight the dichotomy because we have, obviously, the Democrats pushing to extend those, and then we have President Trump pushing to give it to people directly instead of to insurance companies. So it's not like there's one side saying take it all away and the other side saying extend it. I think a more relevant comparison, so you talk about economists being calculators. In basically every economic model that has labor in it, we write down these utility functions, and they have C and they have leisure. So we literally write down in the model the idea that people don't like working, and the only reason they're going to work is to get paid so they can buy stuff. So the implication of that is, for example, a great neoliberalism style policy would be, well, let's just give people universal basic income. They'll be sitting on the couch collecting checks, their consumption's high, their leisure's high, things look good. I would argue you get a lot of dysfunction if people are just sitting around collecting checks and not actually feeling like they have a purpose and they're producing things. So that would be a distinction between that and, let's say, rebuilding the industrial base and making sure that people of any skill and type of knowledge and expertise and people who like to work with their hands, people who like to work on cognitive things, all have productive outlets for their work. In terms of accountability, I would say it's, how much do you empower people who are, who do not necessarily change with institutions? There's many people who are in, career positions in government who the, administrations change and they're still there. And I'm not saying there should be total turnover, but there can also be quite a bit of resistance from those people to, ideas that change at the top. And I think the skepticism of elites comes down in part to a sense of arrogance that can sometimes happen with elites when they don't recognize different spheres of knowledge. I mean, and you have it on both from many different angles. So on the one hand, you have economists who act like they know more about an industry than people who've spent their whole career actually working in it. An economist got a data set and they ran some regressions, but they've never actually worked in it. But then on the flip side, you've got people who they work in Wall Street, they've made $50 million, and then because you made a bunch of money, surely you understand how this policy is going to work in this market. There's different types of knowledge, legal, academic, economic, industry, whatever. We have to recognize those are complementary with each other.
Yes,
One
please.
point I want to make on this accountability thing is there's a difference between accountability and transparency, and I think in many ways transparency is prior to holding people accountable. And I don't know, I think back to the 2016 election and when Bernie Sanders went on Joe Rogan's podcast and had a pretty positive reception. And not only Bernie Sanders, but also Andrew Yang has been on that podcast and was able to get a bunch of people in that particular community interested in universal basic income. And I think that there's people have too low a view of people's capacity to hear arguments, hear details of different policies, actually be persuaded that these things are good for them or could be valuable, and people's capacity to respond to this. And I think it's something that I just don't see pushed on nearly enough. I mean, in this past election, I think I would think of the 2024 election as being the first podcast election. I mean, people are sort of saying that, and I mean, maybe that's overblown. But I think even just perceiving a group of politicians as making an effort to try and meet you where you are and persuade you, I think goes a long way. It makes you feel like there's transparency, even if people aren't being totally honest. And then the lack of, the Democrats being able to, meet people where they are in the same places was highly concerning, I think. So I don't know. I think an attempt to use persuasion and actually be transparent about the reasons and trying to meet people where they are is really important in this.
So two different versions of accountability, and one is reducing the permanent civil service. In other words, that there should be more, if I'm hearing you correctly, there should be more ability to change government at a deeper level, which is a different, that's technocracy. Yes, elite, maybe it's not, I think the average federal workforce probably also doesn't necessarily think of themselves as elite, versus much more persuasion, which is more just a politics that connects. So I want to hear, this is not designed to all pound on economists. That's not the view, but I would like to hear responses. But I also, again, I want to push you on what you said about work. That's a huge difference. What Aaron just said, certainly at New America, we are all about different kinds of work, different kinds of knowledge, different ways of learning, different valuation of handwork and head work. We think that is absolutely critical. And I don't know if that's left or right. I do think it's a big part of an emerging paradigm. For me, the idea that work is purpose and not just for consumption, which I'm not saying you hold, I'm just saying that is essential in terms of thinking about whole human beings. So just pointing out that we're at least not along a traditional spectrum, and I'd love to hear. All right, Jason, you get a response, and then to Heather.
Sort of a few things. One is strongly agree with Aaron that it's sort of arrogance of government if it thinks it knows how to remake all of these industries. That I'm not sure the best experts know it, and when it actually happens, it usually isn't the best experts. There's some things where I think it makes sense. I don't think we have enough microchip fabrication in the United States, so I'm glad we subsidized that. But boy, am I queasy that we gave tens of billions of dollars to the richest, most powerful companies in our economy. And if you did a distributional analysis, the way we like to do for tax policy, for industrial policy, it would be extremely ugly. A lot of that money would be going to owners of capital, and I think we sort of need to own that. On the mistrust of elites, I guess I'd distinguish between two things. One is meeting people where they are in terms of trying to make an economy function for what people want, which absolutely is work as a source of dignity, for example, versus taking people's causal understanding and putting that into policy. And there's this sense that if only we listened to the people and didn't listen to experts, everything would turn out better according to my lights. Let me give you two examples. The insufficient fiscal stimulus and premature pivot to austerity under the Obama administration was not the idea of his economists. In fact, his economists strongly rejected that idea. Where did it come from? It came from the president's political advisors. Why did they have that idea? Because the American people had that idea, and his political advisors were doing their job, which was to channel the American people and figure out how he could better get reelected. Housing. Insufficient response on housing in the financial crisis. Same exact thing. What the people thought was, here's my neighbor, they borrowed a lot, they bought a big house, they lived high on the hog, why are you gonna help them, not me, when I was responsible? So it turns out, that not everything that sort of is democratic and not elite is necessarily gonna line up with what you think are the right and better outcomes. And I think you need to be careful about that. And then the very last point is the same thing. I am torn about the utility function. The one we teach has consumption plus leisure in it. I very much think work should be in the utility function as a positive thing. I think there's a set of things that flow from that, for example, that some people don't necessarily want to pull out the whole thread. So for example, the child tax credit, it does to some degree reduce work. An economist would say that's an income effect. Income effects don't reduce welfare.
It reduces paid work. Can we just be clear?
Yeah, right. No, but yes. But I that was a bunch of the dignity was about paid work and meaning on the job. So I mostly think if it gives you more money to spend more time with your children, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But that's actually a very classic economic view that takes what people do as given and thinks income effects aren't welfare relevant. We can explain that in more detail later. Minimum wage, if the employment elasticity is minus 0.1, so a 10% increase in the minimum wage is a 1% decline in employment, I'd say go for it. That's a 9% increase in wages. If you put labor in the utility function, you're going to be a little bit less likely to want to do that. So there's a whole bunch of issues that you're going to think about differently. Some push you more to the left. Some push you sort of actually away from government intervention and more in the other way. So don't think that just saying these things and invoking them means whatever it is you like is going to be more likely to happen.
Okay, so one of the things, not surprisingly, as we're discussing what are new or concepts of a new economic paradigm, we're obviously talking about political economy, and we're talking about different theories of politics, as old as politics. Heather, let you respond, but again, I would love for you to also address the worker point. And then we're going to come back to your place point. I want to talk about the tension maybe between your focus on sovereignty and sort of how that fits with jurisdictions and place. So Heather, you.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the dignity of work question, and I think it's a little bit implicit in what's been said here. It's about purpose, right? I mean, it's one thing for those of us who have great jobs which are not so physically demanding to talk about, work being, on the labor-leisure trade-off, something that we want to do. But there's also, and I think, Erin, you talked about this, it's that sense of purpose. What am I doing with my life? How am I contributing to my family, community? What am I a part of? And
belonging.
Belonging. Well, and purpose, right? We're all creatures here on the planet. There's like you have to find a way to feed yourself and all of these different things. It seems very sort of basic to being a human. And that brings up a question. We haven't talked at all on this about technology and where the economy is going. I was at this dinner with some, business folks talking about AI, and they start weaving this story that in their vision of the future, there's going to be no jobs, and oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And I find myself just looking at them with a lot of befuddlement. I'm like, there are billions of people on this planet. Do you think they're all just going to sit down and become irrelevant? Long before we get to that moment, social movements, civil society is going to say, well, we have purpose. What is this technology doing for us? And it's a question that we often just sort of elide right over it. We just what is the economy for? Who is it for? I take Jason's points that, when you're thinking about a particular model or a particular policy, you get into these conundrums. But I think that is actually a part of the problem with how we start thinking about these economic questions overall. What are our categories? What are the outcomes that we're looking for? One thing, though, is we're thinking about the trade-offs I don't know how to connect this to what I said before, so I'm going to not even bother to try. So, new little quick topic. As we're thinking about these issues that we're talking about, I often think about what is this going to mean for America's middle class, for the strength of the middle class, not tomorrow or this year or the next political cycle, but what is it going to look like 10, 20, 30 years down the road? And some of these questions about what we make in this country and production and what we're doing, say, for Micron and Intel, these are questions that are going to have decades-long implications, just like our failure to enforce antitrust laws on the books for so many years had implications for where we are today. It's going to take us a while if we want to reshape that and think about not just having 5 national champions, but having a plethora of different firms in any particular sector that you think is really important for national and economic security. But we have to find a way to get out of the short-term thinking. I brought up the political implications, so I understand, I'm both thinking about the next political cycle, but you have to find a way to talk to people about what this is going to mean over the long term, which gets to the abundance questions and what are we investing in. So that just felt like something I wanted to bring into the conversation as well. But I'm curious about your answers on sovereignty.
And maybe more specifically, so the question period has opened, so you should, I'm looking at some great questions now, so you should feel free to use Slido to put questions in, and we will respond. I think one tension, you agree on borders and boundaries. One question is, where are the delineations of sovereignty? In other words, when you think about it, yeah, of course, I understand the national sovereignty in a globalized world. But is it local? Is it state? What are the boundaries there where you can exercise sovereignty, recognizing the importance of place?
Yeah, so in terms of sovereignty, in some sense, I'm thinking about it in a simple form of people are elected to represent the people who elect them. So when you're talking about federal office holders, they are representing their state or their congressional district, or in the case of the president, the entire country. And therefore, what should be in their objective function is precisely the people they're representing. That does not mean there are not international deals and institutions and things like that, but it still means that the participation and the nature of the participation of those things has to all still be to the benefit of the people who are electing you. And there's a balance, of course, between federal, state, and local. I certainly am concerned about, I prefer decentralization of power in many cases because that's closer to the information. That being said, there are instances where you do have to go to a higher level because you can have rent seeking that occurs at smaller granularities. And then just one quick point I'll make on the technology trade thing. I'm someone who I definitely think that technology is something that we don't want to block. Just like technology has a lot of good things to it. Same thing with trade, but neither of them occur in some kind of vacuum, right? It's sort of like when people talk about free trade. There's no such thing as free trade where people write on a sheet of paper, trade is free, barriers gone, right? These agreements are still these big, long agreements. And technology also, you then get to regulatory questions, and so the rules of the road inevitably intersect with these kind of things, and there's also frictions that we have to actually grapple with in order for there to be support for that kind of those activities to continue.
Is it fair to say, would you agree with the doctrine of subsidiarity, where you do things at the lowest level you possibly can, and then if the information is only available at a higher level, or that you need to take account of a wider set of interests? I mean, it's a doctrine that runs the European Union. It's originally a Catholic doctrine.
Yeah, I mean, I would be pragmatic about it. So I certainly do believe in federalism. But again, there are instances where you have to kind of go above that, because there can be rent-seeking and concentration that happen at those levels where if you go beyond that, then you can kind of sometimes push those to the side.
Great. So, Kadim, the next question actually is directly for you. You mentioned the need for greater translators. I love the way you put the gap between the knowledge producers and the salience producers, which is a wonderful way to think about it. But who would be the ideal translators? And I think this is also, again, this is important because of this intersection between a description, there is great distrust, a prescription, there should be greater accountability. Not quite sure what that means, but also how would we get there?
It's a great question. I wanted to go back to some of these questions about representation for a second. It ties into this, but there's representation at the political level, which I think you were primarily talking about, and there it's like people want to elect people that represent them. Makes sense. I don't think we think enough about representation through other kinds of institutions. So I think about elite academic institutions, for example. Oftentimes the kinds of ideas that get produced at elite academic institutions actually create the set of policy options that we can choose from. And so in practice, like where those come from really matter. And so I just don't think that we have a clear way of talking about what it looks like to have good representation in elite academic institutions that produce knowledge. It leads me to wonder. I mean, on the right, there are a lot of questions about things like DEI and diversification, which I think it's interesting because there's at the same time an interest in having people who are the most meritorious ending up in these organizations. But at the same time, there's a want to have ideological diversity, which to me I actually think is at odds. And I think part of the confusion there is that we actually don't generally think about the extent to which these elite academic institutions, the extent to which they produce civic outcomes. We usually think about them, differently. And I think if we thought about the health of our polity as one of the outcomes that these organizations produce, we might think, maybe making sure that we have more geographic representation and therefore different kinds of cultural ideas represented at these institutions. Maybe that actually helps us get towards this outcome that we ultimately want. And so then this notion of diversity, like cultural diversity in these institutions, no longer cuts against merit because the outcome we're trying to produce from these organizations is the health of our polity. So anyways, that's took that in a very different direction. But
it's a very interesting question, though, going back to Danielle's point about, the Constitution, that the point of government is the safety and welfare of the people. So, and we're seeing a lot about governments saying to universities, we fund you, you have to do these things because we fund you. This broader idea then as a quasi-public institution, and obviously many universities are well, actually, I think there are very few that are fully public, because even the fully public ones now have enormous private donations, but that they have a civic, that they do and should produce civic outcomes. Very different than, obviously, the pure production of knowledge.
To get to your original question, though, who should these translators be? All I feel I have the knowledge to point out is that I do think that there's a market failure for these kinds of translators to be produced, at least in economics, which is my field. In general, it is seen as a I don't want to insult you, Jason, because I know you did public work with your life, but in general, in the field, as a researcher and as somebody who gets deep knowledge in a particular area, you're discouraged from doing stuff that is considered pop.
Absolutely.
And that is considered. And so what happens is you end up with a lot of the people with the most useful, deep knowledge about a particular area being very concerned about coming across wrong to their colleagues if they say go to an event like this and say things that aren't like exactly proven in research. And then the people who end up filling those seats are selected in ways that aren't always great. So I think, I could list a number of public intellectuals who have like sort of captured the imagination of the nation, and who are in many ways, I think, sort of less than qualified to take on that task.
It's a great point. There has been there's been a huge drop off, at least in my lifetime, between the inners and in and outers from academia and government, more in economics than political science. It's very increasingly rare in political science, but even among economists. And I will say that when I taught at the University of Chicago Law School, to illustrate your point, and Elena Kagan was asked to go and work for Judge Mikva in the White House, my Chicago colleagues could not understand why she would want to do such a thing, but it has worked out quite well for her.
Yeah, no, in economics,
She's published fewer academic papers lately. Not badly.
No, I mean, in economics, there is zero incentive to do public service whatsoever. I mean, the only thing that's basically valued is publish more papers, publish more papers. I mean, and then the question is, how do you differentiate between quality of papers? It's journal outlet and citations. Now, the citations are other authors citing your stuff. So even if you write a paper that does not in any way directly or indirectly move the needle on a policy outcome, does not matter. That's literally the only thing that matters. So it's quite interesting to think about what is the objective function of a university and of higher education. You know, we can write down the objective function of a profit maximizing firm, but as soon as you get to higher ed, you get it gets a little more nebulous.
So there'll be conversations about universities. Heather, I'll let you respond, but I also want you then to tackle another question, which is really terrific. What does dignity at work look like as policy? And Jason, I'll come to you on that one as well, because I do think part of what we're doing is trying to fit I think a very capacious notion of human nature into pretty narrow policy areas, right? Made by economists, but in other areas made by scientists, made by political scientists as well. So.
Yeah, just to this point about the academics, I think from my perspective, what I have seen is then it narrows the questions that people are asking.
Yes.
And so it does feel like one of the best things that we could do, and one of the things that we tried to do when I was leading the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, was to help scholars see what kinds of questions were really relevant for policymakers, and then see whether or not they wanted to take them up. But that felt like a translator function that seemed really important. Like what is urgent that needs to be asked that may get you a journal paper, but may also just be a really interesting line of reasoning. I wanted to go to a little bit of an optimistic, like what can we do to bring people in? And so you asked about this question about what does dignity at work look like? I mean, that's such a great question. And to my mind, it looks like being able to earn a fair day's pay, being able to have paid time off when you need it to care for yourself or your loved one, being able to afford to live in a neighborhood that is safe, where you have the services that you need, which includes everything from affordable health care to childcare and everything in between. So it seems to me that dignity at work is about people being able to show up for work, do their job, be proud of what they're doing, but also to then be able to have that job be the anchor that allows them to be a full participant in their community. So you have to have that decent pay, but there's a place-based aspect to it as well.
Okay.
So first of all, my favorite writing on diversity is by Danielle, because she emphasizes all the aspects and the ways in which they're complementary and positive sum rather than pitting one against another. At least that's how I interpret it. If I'm being unfair to you, you can correct me later. So I think, socioeconomic diversity, which we've been talking about, geographic diversity, racial diversity, political diversity, gender, et cetera, I think all of those can actually be positive and complementary. I think we have real problems with many of them. The issue of, think about how much research has been done in universities, how much policy translational work has been done on climate change versus opioids. It is, I'll bet, 1,000 to 1. I'm sort of making that number up, but it feels that way. 100,000 people are dying a year from opioids. They're not dying in the communities that a lot of academics come from. I'm not saying this, by the way, to say climate change is bad and we shouldn't be doing it. Absolutely, we should. But it's hard for me to think that our prioritization hasn't been really, really shaped by this in profound and important ways. I'd say, as an aside, climate change is a little bit of a challenge for both thinking in a nationalistic way, because a lot of the argument for it is a global one, and for thinking in sort of a democratic bottom-up way, because it just isn't the thing people care about most. They should care about it. They should also care about opioids. The second thing I would say is on the dignity of work. I sort of like it as much as the next person. I guess I just don't know what a policy that's based on that is. I know what policies that raise wages are. And I don't know the full set of them, and I'd love to know more of them, but basically you give me any two policies and one of them has higher wages, one of them has lower wages, I'm gonna almost always support the one with higher wages. To say dignity of work matters means there have to be circumstances in which you would actually support the lower wage policy over the higher wage because you think the lower wage one comes with more dignity. And I think that's certainly possible. I'm open to that. But I tend to think most people would sort of rather be paid more than less. We can measure that. We should focus on that. And dignity has then become sort of a nice slogan to attach to that. But it's only actually meaningful and only matters if it does say that there are circumstances in which you'd give up on wages to get more of something else.
All right, so here is definitely, I think, a key division line of inquiry for the day, because as I hear that, I mean, this is the difference between you measure unemployment, you measure GDP, you measure wages, versus the effort in the well-being economy or any economy that's premised on a broader vision of human flourishing. And there is a great question about, there's disagreement about what human flourishing looks like and who should decide that. And that is a key question. Should government decide it? Well, some of us think government should at least decide it in response to the problems we're seeing. If you say government shouldn't decide it, you're back in the world of completely free choice.
But I guess I'm still interested in hearing good examples of where just focusing on wages gets you to the wrong place, and you'd sacrifice some wages and have a lower wage thing for more dignified work. Until I hear that,
so
I'm not sure how this is a useful.
We're going to take this offline. I think Heather just gave you some really great policies that reflect dignity. I think the issue of, for instance,
they'd lower wages, but anyway.
Well, no, but I don't. You said that was the question, but we'll take it offline. I don't think that is the question. We have 1 minute and 20 seconds. I'm just going to read a couple of the questions, not to answer them. I'm going to ask each of you to say what gives you optimism, because this is the first panel of the day, and we want to end on some optimism. One of the questions, which I do think is really key, there's a question about care work. Does it provide us with the same kind of purpose? So, Jason, when you said child tax credit reduces work, I was saying, well, no, it increases care work, but not paid care work, or it may if it enables people to stay home with their children. And how do we think about the worth of care, and how does it fit in a utility function? So again, what is measurable? Another is simply, and we didn't touch this at all, but for later today, how to combine industrial policy, national security, and competitive markets, all of which have been raised together. So with that, I'm going to actually, we'll reverse the order. Jason, and then come back, and Aaron will have the last word on what makes you optimistic.
I'm pretty excited about artificial intelligence, which I think has the possibility of expanding the size of the pie, number one. I think its impacts on inequality are really, really uncertain, and I could tell just as many stories of it reducing inequality as increasing it. But regardless, it gives us a hedge, because if it increases it, if we can do the right things with the fiscal system, we can ensure everyone benefits from it, and that's a big if. My biggest concerns about it actually are the non-economic ones that we get. AI turns into like digital slop, addictive videos that are worse than TikTok, drives people into silos, isolates them, and the like. But, and that to me, that last set of issues to me is actually a really quite important one. I have much, much less understanding of what public policy can do, but making us better off and making us be able to share in that, I think if we play it right, this has more potential than most anything we've seen for a while.
Thank you. Heather.
They could pay us for our data. That's just one small thing they could do, maybe. What gives me hope and optimism? I mean, so first of all, being here is incredible. It's such an incredible group of people. And so the fact that so many people are spending a couple of days here in December to have these conversations from different perspectives is really exciting. I think that it gives me hope and optimism that we are finally, in my view, having a different conversation about what we expect from economic policy, and that we are starting to open that space up. So that gives me some hope, and hopefully we can continue that. I would like to see more people who were not trained in economics help engage in some of these deeper questions. So while you have economists up here today, I think I'm excited to continue this conversation with folks that weren't trained in that profession, so we can have a richer view of what kinds of outcomes we're looking for.
Right. Kadeem.
I think that there are more mechanisms now to have nuanced conversations and back and forths with the public, and I think that there's demand for those kinds of conversations. And every time, so like my research focuses on a large portion of it focuses on diversity, with specific focuses on race, and some of the best conversations I have with my work are when I go to AEI or the Civitas Institute, some of these like sort of right of center organizations, and talk to them about equality of opportunity and why these things matter. My experience is that if you have the right medium to have a dialogue about these things, you can make a lot of progress with people whose priors initially are the opposite of yours. And so that makes me quite optimistic.
Thank you. Aaron.
Yeah, so I'd say when I look at the 20th century, the first 2/3 of it, think about the institutions that came out of nowhere. They were created, and then sometimes they went away. Major reforms. I mean, the country and the world transformed in many ways. There was this sense of we can explore and modify these things. And then, in my view, it became kind of ossified. The institutions are what they are, and if you want to challenge them or change them, that's somehow you're touching something sacred, even though it was really actually kind of a new thing. So what I'm optimistic about is that I think we're in a period that's reversing the ossification. I think we're in a period where the Overton window is wider again. People are willing to think about doing bigger things and doing things differently, and I think that creates a lot of opportunity.
Well, there were nods along the panel when you said that. So I'll end. What I'm optimistic about is that care is part of the conversation, and 10 years ago it was nowhere. Nobody talked about care at all. So thank you for a wonderful opening discussion. We opened more questions than we answered, but that's exactly what we should do. So thank you all.